Hello, in this recording I'm going to look a bit more at some of the explanations that are given for less than rational consumption. So, first of all, I've mentioned in a previous recording fear of missing out, and one of my colleagues who will teach you, I think in your second year, Miguel Moital, he's done some work on this in particular, and he's also done work on this in relation to event management. Now, fear of missing out, these are what are known as it's an avoidance emotion. So basically, what's happening is that consumers are seeking to avoid negative emotions. And fear of missing out is that sort of process they go through. So you would maybe lots of your friends are going to go to a particular event, and you want to avoid the negative emotion that you might get if you didn't actually go to that event. You can sort of see there in terms of the definition of fear of missing out is its pervasive apprehension that others might be having a rewarding experience from which one is absent. So a few years ago I had a student who came from Reading, and she did her final year dissertation looking at Reading Festival and FOMO, Associated Reading Festival, and what she was interested particularly was the young people who lived in the Reading area. Because what she argued was that it was their local festival, so there was quite a sort of strong assumption amongst young people that they would attend Reading Festival, and there was quite a bit of FOMO, she felt, amongst the young population, and a feeling that they needed to go to the festival because otherwise they would hear about all the positive things that were happening at the festival, and they were actually missing out on that experience. And so it was quite challenging for young people living in Reading to actually not be at the festival. So there's this concern that you will hear about people doing good things and missing out on these positive emotions, and it can be quite a powerful driver for actually going to an event, and then it's associated with this not wanting to have the feelings of regret from not being there. And where FOMO is particularly powerful, as it says in that last point then, is related to experiential purchasing decisions. So events are experiential. If you don't actually attend that event, it's not like you can purchase it at a later date because that event has actually happened at that one point in time. So it's particularly challenging in relation to events. With lots of purchase decisions, if you decide, not to buy, say, an item of clothing one day, you can probably go back the next day or a week later and buy that. Even with tourism, you decide not to go on a holiday at a particular point of time, you could do it another time. But certainly with live events, there is quite a strong sense of FOMO, because actually once that has happened, you're not going to be able to have that experience again, unless it's something that's a repeated event, and even then you might not have the uniqueness of the experience that maybe your friends have had on that particular occasion. Another thing here, idea here, is romantic consumption theory. So romantic consumption theory looked at the power of advertising, and it looked at how adverts romanticize things in some shape or form, whether that's that somehow having a particular kitchen in your house will completely change your lifestyle, something like that. Going on to a holiday to a particular destination, will be full of fun, the family will be happy, all of those kind of things, which don't necessarily happen, because lots of people go on holiday and have a terrible time with their family and everyone falls out. So, but it is kind of romancing that idea. So what adverts do is, as it says there, they help consumers imagine what an experience might be like. And, consumers begin to believe that the positive situations that are shown in adverts will occur. So they will go on holiday to Corfu, they will have a wonderful time, the family will bond, and the kids will all be happy, etc. And it just might not actually be the case. So it's an illusion of pleasure rather than the actual satisfaction of consuming a product or service might bring. So it's kind of building this illusion, and it creates a lot of daydreaming. So people daydream about quite a lot of particularly bigger purchases. So it's quite significant for events, as when you're thinking about attending an event, people plan ahead, and they can spend quite a lot of time imagining the experience, particularly for a very large scale event, one that's cost quite a lot of money. So I can remember going to the World Athletics Championships when it was in London, and I did quite a lot of planning around it, and imagined everything that would happen. And I mean, we did actually have a good experience, but there was an awful lot vested in it by the time we got there. So basically the idea is the consumer falls in love with the idea of, say, attending an event, but there might be some quite big difference between the real pleasure and the imagined pleasure. And in romantic consumption theory, Campbell tends to suggest that the imagined pleasure, it's always a bit of a disappointment. So I've got there this sort of image of, a festival, I believe it's Glastonbury, so you've got the positive image at the top, that's the, imagined pleasure it might bring, and actually the real experience is in the bottom image, well, the possible real experience. So, and what Campbell argues is it leads to this sort of longing to find new products, and talks about this generation of longing. But, I'd always say, although Campbell talks about it being disappointing, it's not always disappointing. Of course, your festival experience might be like the top image, so could be quite positive. So we spend a lot of time imagining experiences. So, you can perhaps think about events that you've been to, but there's also lots of other things. And I've mentioned tourism in particular as something that we might invest quite a bit of time and energy in thinking about and planning. So there are quite a range of experiences there. If we think about different kinds of events, one which is quite significant that many people will spend a lot of time imagining is things like their wedding. And in a moment I've got an example because I had a student who looked at this specifically and used romantic consumption theory in their dissertation to explore this. So one thing to be aware of is what's called the phases of the consumption experience. So it's not just about what's number 3 on there, the core consumption experience. We have a number of phases. So the first one of these is the pre-consumption experience, when we're actually, thinking about what we might do. We do a lot of searching for, information about, say, a live event. We do a lot of planning. Can you imagine we do a lot of planning for your wedding day? We do a lot of daydreaming about it. So you're thinking about that experience a lot up front. And there can be a lot of time and energy in that. And actually, just thinking about tourism, of course, there are books that are sold, which are tour guides and information about tourism destinations and places, because people do a lot of reading about it. And then you have the purchase experience. Now, these days, a lot of that is quite quick online. But, years ago, I can remember buying tickets to the Rolling Stones, who were performing at a stadium in Manchester where I was a student. And, of course, you had to actually go and physically buy the tickets. You had to go and queue up for them. And in some cases, for particular popular performers, some people actually camped out. So the purchase experience could become quite a big experience in its own right. Then you've got ultimately the core consumption experience. So that was obviously when I went to see the Rolling Stones. And then there's remembered consumption experience. So you're sort of thinking about it afterwards. Now, you can also add to this travel to and travel back from the event. So you can actually add an earlier stage and a later stage, which can be quite significant if you're travelling some distance to take part in that experience. And these days, these stages can become a bit jumbled up together because, for instance, while you're at an event, particularly if you're at a multi-day music festival, you can be searching about what you might do that day. You could look on your phones at the programme, the lineup, and you can make decisions when you're there. And also in terms of the remembered consumption experience, we don't take photos and get them printed. We're taking photos and sharing those experiences with other people while we're actually at the event. So there are ways these days that it's actually become a bit more jumbled up together. And I mentioned in one of my last recordings about word of mouth and e-word of mouth. So word of mouth is these recommendations by friends and family, which are generally considered to be the most powerful. But e-word of mouth has evolved out of that, and particularly with social media and with various, online recommender systems. it's now thought to be very powerful, even though the relationships we might have with the people who make recommendations are quite tangential. So if you think, for instance, about social media influencers, one of the things that happens here, and again, I've had quite a few dissertation students look at social media influencers, is that people might follow an influencer for several years, and that influencer begins to feel like a friend. They become a trusted friend, even though that influencer might have 1 million followers, and you're just one of those followers. The follower feels like they've built up a friendship-like relationship with them. And therefore, those relationships have become very powerful and have been used very much in marketing. I said I'd talk about this romantic consumption theory a little bit more, and I had a final year dissertation student looking at weddings. And one of the things that he was aware of, he worked in his placement year as a wedding planner, and he was interested in the way that brides and grooms were being influenced by what they saw on social media, and in particular Pinterest, because actually it made his life as a wedding planner a bit of a headache, because people often built up quite unrealistic expectations about what might happen at their wedding relative to what money they had to pay. And so Pinterest has a whole load of materials related to weddings that people can search through and look at, as you can see from the screenshot that I've put in there. And one of the things that, well, a number of things that he found that were quite significant and sort of triggered people looking at social media was things like cookies. So how, you know, they're looking at social media feeds, and you know how items will suddenly come up on your Facebook feed that are related to things that you might have searched for elsewhere on the internet, and they often triggered people to search and look at items more on the internet. And then through doing this kind of searches on social media like Pinterest, one of the things that people were doing in their weddings was looking for uniqueness, particularly unique wedding experiences. You know, they were seeking out prestige, and they was doing an awful lot of social comparison in terms of what other people were doing. And what he found was that this was basically driving people's spending on weddings, and actually encouraging people to increase their spending on weddings, which obviously could be very useful from an industry point of view, and particularly for the people who provide lots of wedding services. But in many cases, you know, he did identify that some people were a little bit disappointed by the experience, having had it sort of built up through looking at all these images on social media. So in terms of how this relates back to economics, so economics tends to make me assume we're making these rational choices, but economics and economists are aware that commercial organisations can influence these choices, you know, and so they do. There is, you know, awareness of fashion and trends and things that might actually encourage people to make less than rational choices. And also I've posed a question there, what other organisations might want to influence people's choices. And it's something for you to go and think about, because it isn't just people who are selling products and services. But a couple of suggestions here is actually the government's quite keen to influence people's choices, because they might want people to do certain behaviours that might be helpful. So for instance, at the moment they're trying to discourage people from using public transport, particularly at peak times, so that, you know, key workers can use public transport without buses and trains being crowded, you know, so they might want to think about how they influence people there. And then organisations like the NHS are keen to influence people's choices, you know, because they want people to make healthier decisions. So actually there is a whole branch of behavioural economics which looks at how they can, how we could influence people in various ways.